Hello, my name's Dominic Hodgson. I'm a consultant at Portsmouth, and with my co-host Jonathan, we're going to be going through the history posters.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Goddard. I work in Leicester. I'm also the curator of the Baus Museum. So we're going to take them one at a time. We'll start with Dominic, after you.
Thank you. So the first poster is from the UCLH group from Stella Evas, looking at the evolution of the management of pelvic fracture urethral injury. And this poster makes the point that typically this injury had led to extravasation of urine and sepsis. And the evolution of the management of this problem has been influenced really by war and by developments in radiology, and as we'll see in due course, in evolutions in technique. So the description from the 18th century of a rendezvous procedure where in patients who couldn't be catheterized, and then in the 19th century, the surgery of the war textbook describes a external cystotomy into the perineum as a method of saving life for those that can't be catheterized. But it's in the last 100 years really where there's been an ongoing debate between whether to repair these injuries immediately or by delayed means. And it's really only since the 1970s, the 60s and 70s, where we saw developments in techniques of urethroplasty, that it's been established that you don't need to do anything definitive to begin with, and a suprapubic catheter would suffice. And then the techniques that we now have for urethroplasty often affect a good long-term cure. Jonathan, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that?
No, I think it's interesting, and of course it links with another poster that we'll talk about in a few minutes' time. But yeah, it brings out some interesting names, and it'd be nice to pursue those another meeting, like Guthrie, for example. And you know, I think I can see that. I can see more posters coming from this in the future.
Yeah, and the second poster that you referenced, I'm going to talk about shortly. They describe Bengt Johansson as the godfather of urethroplasty. So yeah, maybe we need to hear more about him as well. So Jonathan, now it's your turn.
Excellent.
I'll get your poster up.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So this next poster is from Rikaki and Sri Prasad, and natural stone breakers is just that, from nature, from plants. This is quite a big topic that they've tried to approach here, and quite sensibly what they've done is they've just picked 3 or 4 different plants. You've got to remember that prior to the 18th century, everything was herbal. So there was no laboratory produced medicines. They were all herbs or minerals. And so this is a huge topic really, and goes all the way back in time. You know, the Romans with Dioscorides, huge books, the Saxons, basically the medical books are all about herbs. And clearly they've picked herbs that are related to urological problems. And things that, you know, like the wild carrot. You know, you wouldn't think about the wild carrot as a treatment for stone disease, but apparently they were using that all the way back in ancient Egypt. The other problem with this is the names, because of course there are Latin names we use now which weren't in existence a long time ago, and different places, and as they've pointed out in the poster, different countries use different names. The other thing they bring out is the use of the name that might mean something. So they talk about a Spanish word for chanquipiedra, which they say which translates as stone breaker, and it certainly was used for bladder stones. But you've got to be careful with that, because if you look at the plant that may well be in your garden, the saxifrage, actually that means stone breaker, but it probably means it grows on a mountain and cracks stones with its roots. So you have to be a little bit careful when you think about that in history. But I thought it was quite nicely done. Again, there's a lot of work that someone could do looking at this in the future. And their conclusion's very good. So they've already pointed out that People are looking at this sort of these herbs to seeing if we can actually get useful modern medications. And remember, things like aspirin and foxglove have been used in the past and are now medications that we use every day. So their conclusion is quite right. There may be more herbal remedies out there that were written down 2,000 years ago, and we might be using them soon. So I thought this was quite a nice poster.
These, you occasionally see a patient who describes taking some herbs and clearing of stones, don't you? So it might be that they're used in cultures that don't have the same Western medical traditions that we do.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. But yeah, nice one, I thought.
So as promised, this is the second poster from UCLH, again by Stella, looking at the evolution of urethroplasty for urethral strictures, which ties in nicely with the other one. And they start off by showing some catheters from BC, which are remarkably similar in shape to what we might use today. There's a description of an external urethrotomy, or a perineal section, in what was described as an old fornicator. So we could perhaps imagine how he got his stricture disease from 1665 by an Edward Mullins. So the only options really were to either dilate strictures or to use a perineal section as he described, or wait for the any extravasated urine to form a fistula with the skin. But then with the advent of anaesthesia in the middle of the 19th century, people started excising short bulbar strictures. And there were also at that time techniques for hypospadias described. And in 1915, it was Hamilton Russell who published his first series of urethroplasties. And the poster goes on nicely to describe how techniques have evolved since then in terms of mobilization, in terms of grafts, and in terms of flaps, right through to what we see today.
I was interested to see the name Mullins. So they were a stone cutting family from 17th century London about the time of the Civil War. And I think Edward was the one that ran off and joined the war. So they're quite interesting people. Do you know, you sort of think of urethroplasty as quite a modern thing. So it's quite nice to take it back into the 19th century and say, actually, it's not that new. We may be slightly better at it now, but they've been trying it for quite a while. It matches nicely with the first poster.
It does, doesn't it? Yeah, yeah. So, Jonathan, I'm hoping that you're expecting something on dogs now.
I am expecting something on dogs. So the first thing I want to say about this this poster is that the author's done a very nice job online recording it. So I'd encourage people watching us to actually take the time to go and look at these posters online. Some people have done a very nice job recording what they've done, and you should be able to pick that up online. So this is a nice idea, dogs in urology. Now, obviously, we're all aware that animals have been used for experimentation for thousands of years. Galen anatomized apes, which is why he got the prostatic anatomy wrong, probably. But this focuses specifically on dogs, and actually, this is mainly about renal physiology. And this is something I have come across before, that it's really important, and I think we forget this. We talks about nephrectomy in the 19th century, which is really the second half of the 19th century. And I think we tend to look back and go, ooh, that's a scary big operation, and think in terms of someone doing a nephrectomy under minimal anesthesia in a non-sterile world. But actually what they were frightened of is taking out a kidney. Can a man survive with one kidney? Or in this case, a lady, because the first planned nephrectomy was on a lady. And these experiments on dogs showed that, yes, animals can survive with just one kidney. So that was one reason why it's very interesting. The other thing I picked up here, they talk about Frank Hinman's work, who's quite a famous American urologist and anatomist in the 1920s. His son was a very famous urologist as well. And he tied off the ureters of dogs. And I think, now, Dom, you're cleverer than me. You probably know if I'm wrong here, but I think this is the data we still use now. When we say you have a ureteric stone, we'd like to see you and get you sorted in 4 weeks. The data goes back to the 1920s and Frank Hinman saying, if you tie off a dog's ureter, in about 4 weeks, you're losing renal function. So this is it's a nice idea, and very dog friendly.
I seem to remember Hunter doing something urological to dogs as well, didn't he?
Yeah, he did all sorts of terrible things to animals, and chickens as well.
Yeah.
Yes, he did. I can't quite remember, but yes, you're right. He did do something urological to dogs. And dogs are one of the few animals that form stones as well, aren't they?
Yes, the Dalmatian particularly, I think.
Absolutely right.
There you go.
There we are.
So, Jonathan, I'd just like to echo what you said about the posters that have got recordings with them, because it really does bring it alive. And this is a fantastic poster, and the Ian Wharton has done exactly that. So please go online to the posters and listen. So this is a fascinating poster about the La Famille Colotte. So the Famille Colotte spanned 8 generations of stone cutters from the late 15th century to late 18th century. And they became so synonymous with stone cutting that the family was known as the Lithotomous. And Ian uses this very nice phrase that they had a lithotomy monopoly in Paris at one point. So please go and look at this poster. And what's really intriguing is that they managed to become such a famous family and so successful because they kept, like a lot of the stone surgeons at the time, they kept the secrets of their techniques very close to their chest, and therefore were able to sustain this monopoly for several generations. But then, of course, Francis Colotte posthumously published a treatise on his work at the end of the 18th century, which sort of secured his reputation, but also was, of course, the family's downfall, because all of a sudden other surgeons could use their techniques, and so this initiated a new era of French lithotomy.
Yeah, really interesting. There were several families. There was a family in Scotland, in East Anglia. There were the Mollins that we mentioned before in London. The thing that struck me is the image taken of the instruments from Operation de la Télé. That's clearly completely stolen from John Douglas's book on the suprapubic, and you recognise that thing that looks like a trowel is actually a sharpened. It's a blade to go straight down into the bladder suprapubically. Absolutely terrifying. So yeah, very good poster, and as you say, really nicely presented online. Ah, yes, my turn again. Now, it's a little bit like going out for a meal. I have, to some extent, have poster envy, because Dominic's had some posters that I thought, oh, I'd quite like to talk about that. But this is a good one. I really like this one. And this is from the Ian Wharton stable again. I know Ian, he's very keen to get his juniors to present. Really good story. And this is one of those things where you think, oh, yeah, I know this. But actually, it's also, I didn't know that. Things I did not know about. Jean de Doet is a Dutchman, and he removed his own bladder stone. And I didn't realise he was associated with Nicholas Tulp, as the very, very famous picture of the Tulp's anatomy lesson. I hadn't twigged that he was a blacksmith, and of course he made his own knife. And I think the really interesting thing here, so we're talking about perineal lithotomy, cutting through the perineum to get the stone out of the bladder. They make a really good point towards the end here, that actually 2 people had tried this before, and it is possible they'd sort of done half a job and the stone could have been in the perineal tissues, and he just had to cut onto the tissues. I'm not obviously putting him down, you know, the fella cut into his own perineum with his homemade penknife. But this was a really nice poster for me, because I did learn quite a lot from this.
Absolutely. I mean, I agree with your analogy with food envy. I thought this was probably the best ones that you got to look at, and very nicely described on the recording that's available online. So this of my posters, the Lithotomous was very, very good, but this is probably my favourite. So this comes from Northampton General, and Mr. Odell, who I think is the narrator on this, works in the archive of the museum there, and I'd be interested, Jonathan, to hear your views on this. Whether you ever heard of John Elderton before, but this is fascinating. You have.
Yeah, this was my envy one, actually, that you'd got.
Right, yeah.
I think it was Ross Warner that was speaking.
Was it? Sorry, yeah.
And it's a really interesting story, because, again, I've heard of this chap, I've seen that picture, and I knew nothing. I couldn't even find out his dates of birth and death. So already this has been helpful to me. Thank you very much, Ross and Frank and Marek Miller. And what they say is they can't really find any evidence that this old lithotrite, which predates the French ones, was ever used. And I'm sure I've come across a throwaway remark in a journal somewhere saying, someone saying, oh, they tried it and it didn't work very well. So I just need to find that reference for Ross, so he can write this up as a really nice paper with a good ending. But you're right, it's a lovely poster, this one.
Yeah, so the suggestion is that this lithotrite was made in 1819, and then it fits with, I think there's a publication described there as well. And the Civial and de Toile in France only really produced theirs in the mid 1820s. So in theory, and this isn't, you know, if you look at references to lithotrites, Elderton isn't there. So in theory, we beat the French here by 6 or 7 years, but that's the next piece of work they've got to do, haven't they, to find some evidence of it being used and being used successfully.
Let's hope so. So the next poster is Kiki Mystery, and coming from Melissa Davis's centre. And what's nice about this is that I'm hoping it was Kiki, it may have been Melissa that thought this up, or one of the other authors, that was saying, well, things have changed. We're not using mesh now for incontinence. We're using other things. For example, the bulking injections. And so somebody here has thought, ooh, where's this come from? Which is exactly what we like in the urology history session at Baus. So this really is, I love this. This is putting in all sorts of things next to the female urethra to try and control the incontinence. And I have come across some of this before. Robert Gassuni, who is an Austrian, they talk about him using paraffin, basically Vaseline. So he was injecting Vaseline next to the urethra. But what's interesting about him is he was injecting it all over the place. So I believe from my reading on this chap, he was just injecting it all over, thinking I've got a miracle substance that I can use all over the place. And he started off by, he had a chap that came with no testicles, and he was going to the army. He was embarrassed to have his medical. So he injected paraffin into the scrotum to give him new testicles. And then obviously he was using it with what appears to be some good results next to the female urethra. And then they take the story through various injectables up until, well, obviously it looks like they're using Bulkamed down there at the moment, passing through things like cod liver oil. So they mentioned this chap, Brian Muirlis, who was indeed an obstetric reg in London, but actually I think was South African and went back to practice in South Africa. I mean, where he came up with the concept of injecting cod liver oil. But yeah, it's really nice, this, because it's a historical look at what we're doing now and what's just changed. So nice poster.
And it's all about getting the substance, isn't it? You know, various iterations of, and until you find something that we think is inert, but also has more than a transitory effect. So yeah, very nice. But yeah, it's interesting how we come back to where we've been before in terms of how we practice.
Yeah.
So, Jonathan, I know this will be close to your heart because you've written extensively on All Saints Hospital and also Edward Canny Ryle, but this is from the Chelsea and Westminster, the hospital. They've done a poster on All Saints Hospital, 100 years on, lost but not forgotten. So, it was actually 1911 when Canny Ryle's opened his first All Saints Hospital, but I think we'll allow them to have the 100-year celebration because the iteration of All Saints that they're describing, I think, was the one that it moved from in 1911 to Finchley Road, and that was an inpatient hospital. So the 1911, the All Saints Hospital that Canny Ryle opened still functions as an outpatient, but 100 years since the inpatient facility started in Finchley Road. The original one was on Vauxhall Bridge Road. And then it moved again in 1932 to the Elephant and Castle. And I didn't quite appreciate this, but in the All Saints in the Elephant and Castle from 1932 actually had 52 beds, which made it the biggest urology facility in the country. And eventually with the NHS, it became part of the Westminster group of hospitals. But I think I know Canny Ryle's Jonathan is a bit of a hero of yours, and we very much like any opportunity to celebrate him.
Absolutely, and I know Mike Deneen, who's the senior author on this, is a great fan of Canny Ryle, and I think he really is. He's not just the hospital that's been forgotten; he's a sort of forgotten hero as well. And he really pushed endoscopic surgery. So with everyone else, I mean, you know, in England we tend to be a bit behind things, but he picked up on the American idea of cystoscopic surgery, endoscopic surgery, and really pushed it in London. Partly, I suspect, because as an Irishman coming over, he wasn't really welcome in the London scene. And the other Irishman that worked with him, Terence Millen, and I think he, and quite rightly, stuck his finger up his nose at St. Peter's and got on with the TURPs. And they were the first people to do TURP in this country.
I like that bit about you're only in hospital for 3 weeks after a TURP, as opposed to I can't quite read it, but 13 weeks after an open prostatectomy. Yeah. Whereas we'd hope to be based in the main now. Yeah.
Great. Oh, yes. Now this is interesting. So this is Sarah Pratley, and you see in the middle we have Harry Heald, who of course is one of our the Baus team. So it's good to see Harry getting onto a poster. This is interesting because you look at this, and first of all you think, oh, well, is this history? This looks like a management slide. But of course it's history. So this is looking back at the last 20 years of the Baus meetings, and actually, this is really good history because they're looking actually at real data here. You know, I'm sort of going back looking at vague suggestions of things in Anglo-Saxon England, but this is real data. And they've looked at how the meeting has changed and evolved over the last 20 years. And in particular, what's nice is to look at the split of the different sections and the posters that were submitted. And I have to say we're a bit weak in history of urology, but we're all right. We're holding our own. We're still holding our own. Again, this is quite a contemporary concept because they're talking about what's happening this year. So we're 75 years of Baus. The first annual meeting was in June 1945, and now in 2020. We're having we're here recording a video meeting, completely different. So that group of men, and actually that's not, I was about to say they were all men, they weren't men, there were 2 female members of BOWS right from the very beginning. So that group of men and ladies right back in 1945, completely different to how we are now. And so actually it's a really nice poster to finish on. This brings us up to date to COVID, with what's happened, how it's changed over the last few years. We've gone down to from the 4 days to the 3 days. There's a comment in there saying they're getting feedback from people now saying, oh, maybe it should be a 2-day meeting. And of course now it's a virtual meeting. So it's if you want, you could say it's a no-day meeting, or it's as many days as you want meeting. You can sit and look at these posters online, maybe forever. So a really nice poster to finish with. That's the poster History of Medicine, History of Urology poster session for BOWS 2020. I very much encourage you to go online and look at the posters. There's a lot of work gone into these posters. And what I'm hoping to see is I'd quite like to see some work coming out of them and see some published papers.
Absolutely. I'd just like to echo the quality of the post has been fantastic, and I'd like to thank all those who prepared the posters and given us some very fascinating things to look at. So thank you very much.
Maybe see you next year.